The candle in the window of that little house in Hull, England, was still burning long after most of the town had gone to sleep. Inside, a small, sickly boy with pale skin and eyes that seemed too big for his face sat propped up in bed, coughing into a handkerchief. Nobody looking at him that night could have possibly guessed that this frail child, who could barely see across a room without squinting, who spent more time with doctors than with other children, would one day stand up in the most powerful parliament on earth and take on an empire built on human suffering. Nobody could have guessed that this small boy would spend 46 years of his life fighting a battle almost everyone told him he could not win. And nobody could have guessed that when he finally did win, the world itself would begin to change. His name was William Wilberforce, and his story is one of the most extraordinary, most inspiring, most quietly astonishing stories in all of Western history. It is a story about faith. It is a story about friendship. It is a story about courage that refused to quit, even when the man carrying it weighed barely more than 100 pounds and was often too sick to stand. It is a story about how one short, sickly, unlikely man helped bring an end to one of the greatest evils humanity has ever known. And if you stay with me, you will hear things about him that most Americans have never been told. You will hear about the deathbed confession of a former slave ship captain who wrote the most famous hymn in the English language. You will hear about a friendship between two boys that shaped the destiny of nations. You will hear about the night William Wilberforce nearly walked away from politics forever, and the one letter that stopped him. And you will hear, in his own recorded words, what he thought of the world he was trying to change. But to understand any of that, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to Hull, a busy port town on the northeast coast of England, where a boy was born on the 24th of August, 1759. His father, Robert Wilberforce, was a wealthy merchant. His grandfather had been mayor of Hull twice. The family had money, real money, the kind of money that came from Baltic trade and shipping. In American terms, imagine one of those old New England merchant families in Boston or Salem, the kind whose ships sailed everywhere and whose warehouses lined the docks. That was the Wilberforce family. Little William grew up surrounded by ledgers, sea captains, cargo manifests, and the smell of salt water. But money, as any good American proverb will tell you, cannot buy health. And little William did not have much of that. He was small. He was thin. His eyesight was terrible, so poor that he would struggle with it his whole life. He was described by people who knew him as short, even for the standards of that time, likely somewhere around 5 feet 3 or 5 feet 4 inches tall in adulthood. Some contemporaries said even less. In an age when the average grown man was already shorter than modern Americans are used to, William Wilberforce was noticeably small. He was so slight that a friend later joked he looked like a shrimp when he first stood to speak in Parliament, until he opened his mouth, and then, as another observer wrote, the shrimp grew into a whale. When William was just 8 years old, his father died. His mother, overwhelmed and ill herself, sent him to live with his uncle William and his aunt Hannah in Wimbledon, near London. And this is where the first great turn in his story happens. His aunt and uncle were what people at the time called Methodists, or evangelical Christians. They were followers of the movement led by John Wesley and George Whitefield, that great spiritual awakening sweeping across England and echoing across the American colonies at almost the very same time. In their home, young William met, in the flesh, a man whose name we are about to hear over and over again. A man who would change his life. A man who would help change history. His name was John Newton. Yes, that John Newton. The John Newton, the former slave ship captain, the man who wrote Amazing Grace. Picture the scene. a little boy of 9 or 10, sitting in his aunt's parlor, listening to a big weathered man with rough hands and a rougher past speak about God, about mercy, about how a wretch like him had been saved. Newton had spent years in the slave trade. He had captained ships that carried human beings across the Atlantic in chains. He had done things he would spend the rest of his life trying to atone for. And now, transformed, he was a preacher. And little William, small, sickly, curious William, listened to him with wide eyes. Newton took a liking to the boy. He treated him almost like a son. William, in turn, later wrote that he came to love Newton like a parent. But here is where the story takes a hard turn. William's mother, back in Hull, got word that her son was becoming an evangelical, and she was horrified. In the England of the late 1700s, evangelicalism was seen by the upper classes as fanatical, embarrassing, low class. It was for enthusiasts, for poor people, not for a young gentleman of means. She yanked him back home. She and his grandfather worked hard, very hard, to scrub the religion out of him. And for a while, it worked. Young William, eager to fit in, threw himself into the pleasures of English gentlemanly life. Cards, theater, wit, late nights, fine dinners. He loved music. He loved company. He loved to sing, and had a voice good enough that people asked him to. He was sent to Cambridge, to St. John's College, at the age of 17. He hated the way many of his fellow students behaved, but he did not exactly buckle down himself. He later admitted he did the bare minimum academically. He had money, he had wit, he had charm. He did not need to try. And it was at Cambridge that he met a shy, brilliant, focused young man his own age, a boy named William Pitt, the son of a former prime minister, a boy who would one day become the youngest prime minister in the history of Great Britain. The two Williams became inseparable. They spent evenings together talking politics, reading, joking, dreaming. Their friendship, one of the most consequential friendships in modern political history, would last until Pitt's death. It is one of the great stories of loyalty and shared purpose in the whole English-speaking world. And it is a friendship without which slavery might not have ended when it did. In 1780, at the astonishing age of 21, William Wilberforce ran for Parliament. He was elected to represent his hometown of Hull, 21 years old, barely old enough to buy a pint under some modern laws. Standing in the House of Commons, he had spent nearly £9,000 of his own money to win the seat, an eye-watering sum in those days, roughly the equivalent of well over $1 million in modern American money, if you adjust for the standard of living of a landed gentleman. He did not care about the money. He wanted the seat. He got it. And why did he go into politics? The truth, by his own admission, was that at first he had no grand plan at all. He was ambitious. He liked being at the center of things. He was, in his own words later in life, thoughtless and dissipated in his youth. He wanted to be somebody. He wanted the applause. He wanted the excitement. Only later would God, as he saw it, give him a reason to be there. Just 4 years after his first election, at only 24 years old, he won a much bigger seat, representing all of Yorkshire, one of the largest and most prestigious constituencies in Britain. His friend William Pitt, at just 24 himself, became Prime Minister that same year. Two young men, best friends, at the very top of the world's most powerful empire. It sounds like something out of a novel, but it happened. Then came the change, the great change. The change that turned an ambitious young politician into one of the most important moral figures of the last 300 years. In the winter of 1784 and into 1785, Wilberforce took a long trip across Europe with a family friend and tutor named Isaac Milner. Milner was a strong evangelical Christian, and on those long carriage rides across France and Switzerland and Italy, the two men began to read the Bible together and discuss it seriously. Wilberforce, who had grown up hearing this language and then walked away from it, found something in him beginning to shake loose. By the time he returned to England, he was going through what he called his great change, a deep, quiet conversion, a rediscovery of the evangelical Christian faith of his aunt and uncle, and of John Newton. But he was terrified. He was a member of Parliament. He was moving in circles where open, serious religion was considered ridiculous, embarrassing, career-ending. He seriously considered walking away from politics altogether. He thought maybe he should leave the House of Commons, retire from public life, and devote himself to God quietly. Maybe even become a clergyman. He was so troubled that he did something remarkable. He went to see John Newton, the former slave ship captain, the man he had known since childhood, the man he had not spoken to in years. That meeting, in December of 1785, is one of the pivotal moments in the history of the modern world. Newton, wise old Newton, listened to the young member of Parliament describe his crisis. And then Newton told him something that changed everything. He told him not to leave politics. He told him to stay right where he was. He told him that God had put him there for a purpose. Newton, who had once been a slave trader, who now sang hymns about grace, urged Wilberforce to remain in Parliament and use his position for good. Wilberforce would write about this meeting for the rest of his life. It was, in his own words, the moment that set his course. He stayed. He stayed in politics. And now the question was, what was that purpose Newton had spoken of? The answer came not long after, in the form of a growing conviction that would soon consume him. Wilberforce began to meet with a small group of dedicated abolitionists, men like Thomas Clarkson, a tireless researcher and campaigner who traveled the country gathering evidence of the horrors of the slave trade. Clarkson, physically strong where Wilberforce was frail, rode thousands of miles on horseback, interviewing sailors, collecting the shackles and thumbscrews, and branding irons of the trade, documenting the brutality in a way no one else had ever done. Clarkson brought a suitcase of these objects to Wilberforce and to Parliament. Actual iron chains. Actual mouth openers used to force feed enslaved people who tried to starve themselves to death. Diagrams of slave ships showing human beings packed like cargo, side by side, chained, in spaces so tight they could barely turn over. When Wilberforce saw these things, when he read the sworn testimonies of sailors who had worked those ships, something in him hardened into stone. He wrote in his diary the famous line, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." By manners he meant morals, the moral culture of the nation. And now he had his life's work. But why him? Why did he care so much? Why did a rich, sickly, small young man from a merchant family in Hull decide that this cause that everyone told him was impossible, would be his cause? The answer, if you are honest with the historical record, comes down to one word: faith. His Christian faith, his belief, sincerely held, that every human being was made in the image of God, and therefore possessed a dignity that no man on earth had the right to deny. Some people today ask a fair question: did religion justify slavery? Because history is complicated, and the truth is that yes, many people, including many Christians, used cherry-picked verses to defend the institution of slavery. There is no honest way to pretend otherwise. But it is equally true, and equally verifiable, that the most sustained, organized, ferocious opposition to the transatlantic slave trade came from Christians who believed their faith demanded its abolition. Quakers in Pennsylvania, Methodists in England, evangelicals like Wilberforce. And when people ask, did Jesus dislike slavery? The honest historian will point out that the New Testament itself contains verses that early abolitionists like Wilberforce read as a direct condemnation of the slave trade. In the first letter to Timothy, chapter 1, the writer condemns men stealers, kidnappers, human traffickers in the very same list as murderers. Wilberforce and his allies pounded that verse like a hammer. On May 12, 1789, William Wilberforce stood up in the House of Commons and delivered a speech that lasted more than 3 hours. He was so weak that day that he could barely stand, but he stood, and he laid out one horrible piece of evidence after another, exactly what was happening on those ships. He named names, he quoted testimony. He described the Middle Passage in such vivid, unbearable detail that even hardened members of Parliament were seen weeping. And he said, and this is a direct quote from that speech that has echoed for centuries, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know." That is a Wilberforce quote. That is real. And it is one of the most quoted lines in the entire history of moral argument. And then he lost. His motion to abolish the slave trade failed. He tried again in 1791. He lost. He tried again in 1792. He lost. 1793. Lost. 1794. Lost. 1795. Lost. Year after year, session after session, he stood up in that same fragile body and demanded that Britain end its participation in the transatlantic slave trade. And year after year, Parliament voted him down. The reasons were always the same. The West Indies plantations were too profitable. The Royal Navy depended on the trade. British jobs depended on it. British ports like Liverpool and Bristol grew rich off of it. Powerful men, some of them personal friends of the king, owned slave ships and sugar plantations and did not want to lose their fortunes. There was a war with revolutionary France, and everyone kept saying it was not the right time. It was never the right time, and the slave traders themselves came for Wilberforce. They spread rumors about him. They caricatured him in the London papers. He received threats. A Liverpool captain named Robert Norris, whom Wilberforce had once considered a witness against the trade, ended up being paid off by the slave lobby to testify in favor of it, betraying Wilberforce publicly. One captain, a man named Robert Kimber, was widely rumored to have threatened Wilberforce's life after Wilberforce raised the case of an enslaved girl who Kimber had allegedly beaten to death. Wilberforce was mocked, insulted, dismissed. His frail body was called weak. His voice was called womanish. His faith was called fanaticism. Did he give up? He did not. And this is one of the hardest things for modern Americans to grasp. We live in a world of instant results. If a cause does not trend on social media within a week, we move on. Wilberforce spent nearly 2 decades in the wilderness on this one issue. 20 years of getting up in the House of Commons and being told no. 20 years of watching slave ships continue to leave English ports. 20 years of knowing that while he was eating dinner in London, human beings were dying in the holds of British vessels crossing the Atlantic. What kept him going? 3 things: his faith, his friends, and his wife. Let me tell you about her. In 1797, at the age of 37, William Wilberforce met a young woman named Barbara Ann Spooner. He had never been much for romance before. He had focused on politics and reform. But this time, something clicked. Their courtship lasted only about 8 days before he proposed. Yes, you heard that right. About 8 days. They were married a little over a month later. He was 37. She was 20, and by every account of their household, they were happy, genuinely happy. Together they had 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters, born between 1798 and 1807. Their names were William, Barbara, Elizabeth, Robert Isaac, Samuel, and Henry William. He adored them. Visitors to his home wrote that the great abolitionist could be found crawling around on the floor with his children, pretending to be a horse, letting them ride on his back. He was a warm, playful, sometimes indulgent father in an age when many fathers of his class were cold and distant. He also lived a life almost free of vices, though he was no saint and would have laughed at anyone who called him one. He drank wine as almost everyone of his class did, though very moderately compared to his peers. He did not smoke. He gave away enormous sums to charity, often anonymously. At one point, he was giving away more than a quarter of his annual income. When friends fell on hard times, he quietly covered their debts. Was he rich? Yes, he inherited real wealth. Later in life, thanks to poor investments, made partly to help his eldest son's failed business, he lost most of it. He ended his life with far less money than he had started with, and he seemed genuinely relieved about it. He suffered constantly from ill health. His eyesight got worse as he aged. He had a condition, likely ulcerative colitis, that caused agonizing digestive pain. His doctors prescribed opium for it, which was the standard medicine of the age, and Wilberforce took it in small daily doses for many years as prescribed. He was open about it. He wrote about how it dulled his mind. He hated it, but he needed it to function. He also suffered from what was likely a curvature of the spine that got worse in old age. Later in life, he had to wear a steel brace under his clothes just to keep himself upright. Imagine standing up in Parliament to give a 3-hour speech in an iron brace, half blind, on opium for pain, and doing it year after year, decade after decade, because you refuse to let human beings be treated as property. The friendship with William Pitt, meanwhile, was a source of both strength and heartbreak. Pitt, as Prime Minister, personally supported abolition. He gave speeches in favor of it. But Pitt was also the leader of a government fighting for its life against Napoleon and revolutionary France. He would not, or could not, spend the political capital needed to force abolition through. Wilberforce grew frustrated. Pitt kept promising more than he delivered on this one issue. Some historians have argued that Pitt effectively betrayed the cause by not doing everything in his power. Others argue that he did what he could within the impossible pressures of wartime politics. The two friends never fell out publicly, but there was a shadow between them. When Pitt died young in 1806, worn out at just 46 years old, Wilberforce wept. His best friend was gone, and slavery was still legal. But then, only a year later, the miracle happened. In 1807, after nearly 20 years of fighting, William Wilberforce and his allies finally won. The Slave Trade Act passed the House of Commons on February 23, 1807, by a stunning vote of 283 to 16. When the results were announced, the entire House stood and cheered William Wilberforce. Grown men, hardened politicians, men who had voted against him for 2 decades, turned toward him and applauded. Wilberforce sat there, tears rolling down his face, head bowed. He could barely speak. Britain, the greatest naval power in the world, had just outlawed its participation in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, we have to be very careful here. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of the whole story, and Americans in particular sometimes get it wrong. The 1807 Act did not free a single enslaved person. It did not abolish slavery itself. What it did was make it illegal for British ships to carry enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, and for British subjects to invest in that trade. Anyone caught doing it faced fines, and later, the death penalty. It was a body blow to the slave trade worldwide, because the British Royal Navy would now patrol the Atlantic and stop slave ships from any nation. Over the next 50 years, the British Navy would intercept about 1,600 slave ships and free something like 150,000 Africans directly from those holds. It was the beginning of the end. But slavery itself, actual slavery, on the plantations of the Caribbean and elsewhere, was still perfectly legal. Wilberforce knew this. And even though his health kept declining, he kept fighting. Now the goal became not just to end the trade, but to end the institution itself. Emancipation, total emancipation. He formed a new society for this purpose in 1823. He kept writing, kept lobbying, kept meeting with allies. But his body was failing. In 1825, at 65 years old, he finally retired from Parliament. He had served for 45 years. He handed the torch to younger men, most notably Thomas Fowell Buxton, who took over leadership of the abolitionist cause in the Commons. Wilberforce spent his final years quietly, living with his family, praying, writing letters, receiving visitors from all over the English-speaking world. Americans who traveled to Britain often made a point of trying to visit him. He was already a legend on this side of the Atlantic. Frederick Douglass would later write with admiration about the British abolitionists. American abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison, studied Wilberforce's methods carefully. His book, called A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians, published in 1797, became a bestseller and was read by millions on both sides of the ocean. And then, in the summer of 1833, the news came. On July 26, 1833, the House of Commons passed the third reading of the Slavery Abolition Act. Slavery itself, throughout most of the British Empire, was going to be abolished. Wilberforce, lying gravely ill in bed at his cousin's home in London, heard the news. He was reported to have said, quote, "Thank God that I have lived to witness a day in which England is willing to give 20 millions sterling for the abolition of slavery." That was the compensation the British government agreed to pay, not to the sadly, but to the slave owners, in order to buy their consent for emancipation. It is one of the darker footnotes in the story, and Wilberforce and his allies knew it was an ugly compromise. But it was the price of getting the bill passed at all. 3 days after that vote, on July 29, 1833, William Wilberforce died. He was 73 years old. He had lived just long enough to know that his life's work was done. The bill received royal assent about a month later, and on August 1, 1834, slavery officially ended across most of the British Empire. He was buried in Westminster Abbey next to his best friend William Pitt. Both houses of Parliament suspended their business to attend his funeral. Peers of the realm carried his coffin. Members of the royal family sent their representatives. Ordinary Londoners lined the streets in silence as the procession passed. A short, sick, half-blind man from a merchant family in Hull was being buried among kings, next to a prime minister mourned by an entire nation. There is a marble statue of him in the abbey today. Underneath it, an inscription praises his eloquence, his integrity, his cheerful spirit, and, above all, the fact that he lived to see the extinction of that odious traffic in the persons of his fellow men, which he had spent so many years opposing. Now, let me answer some of the questions that Americans hearing this story tend to ask, because you deserve honest answers. Did William Wilberforce own slaves? No. There is no historical evidence that William Wilberforce ever owned enslaved people. He did not run a plantation. He did not profit personally from the trade. He came from a merchant family in a port town, and it is possible that some earlier family fortune touched shipping indirectly, but he himself was not a slaveholder. On this, the record is clear. Was he a hypocrite? This is a fair, modern question, and it deserves a fair answer. Wilberforce was a man of his time. He did not believe in universal suffrage. He was skeptical of French-style revolution. He worried, as many did, about social upheaval. He was, in short, a conservative reformer, not a radical. He supported the British Empire. He believed in the monarchy. On the question of whether he thought Africans were fully equal to Europeans, in every sense, the historical record shows that he did, at least, insist on their full humanity and full dignity as souls made in the image of God, which was the foundation of his whole argument. But he also, at times, spoke about Africans in the paternalistic language of his era, framing abolition, partly, as a duty of the strong to the weak. Modern ears rightly find some of that language uncomfortable. But by the moral standards available to him, and by the actions he actually took, most historians consider him a genuinely good man, not a hypocrite. He risked everything, his health, his reputation, his political career, for people he would never meet. Was Wilberforce racist? By modern standards, he held some views that today we would call paternalistic. But he also stood in Parliament and said, over and over, that Africans were his brothers, his fellow human beings, and that their suffering was a stain on the British nation. In an era when most of his peers considered such statements absurd, he made them loudly, publicly, and repeatedly. What did Britain really abolish slavery for? Historians have debated this for 2 centuries. Some argue that industrial capitalism was making plantation slavery less economically vital, and that Britain abolished slavery when it could afford to. Others, and this includes major historians like Christopher Leslie Brown, have shown persuasively that at the moment Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, the trade was still highly profitable, and abolition was economically painful for the empire. The most honest answer is that a combination of forces was at work. Economic change played a role. Slave rebellions in the Caribbean, especially the Haitian Revolution, played a huge role. And the moral campaign led by Wilberforce, Clarkson, Newton, Granville Sharp, Olaudah Equiano, the formerly enslaved writer, Hannah More, the female reformer, and thousands of ordinary British men and women who signed petitions and boycotted sugar, played an enormous role. The truth is that all of these forces together brought slavery down. Who really ended slavery in the British Empire? Legally, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, passed under the government of Prime Minister Earl Grey, is the law that did it. But politically, morally, and historically, no name is more associated with that victory than William Wilberforce. He was, without a doubt, the leading voice, the anchor, the conscience of the movement in Parliament. And it took him, and it took the movement he helped lead, roughly 46 years from his first serious anti-slavery activity in the mid-1780s to full abolition in 1833. 46 years, almost half a century. It is one of the longest sustained political campaigns in the history of representative government. Who was the very first to try to stop slavery? That depends on how far back you want to go. Slavery has existed in nearly every human civilization. Various people across history condemned it in various ways. But if you mean the modern movement, the movement that finally, permanently, put slavery on the road to extinction in the Western world, that movement was born in the 1760s and 1770s, largely among Quakers in Pennsylvania and Great Britain. Wilberforce was not the first, but he was, by common historical judgment, the most important political leader of the effort in the country whose empire had done more than any other to spread slavery around the Atlantic. Now let me tell you the piece of this story that always makes people cry. Do you remember John Newton, the former slave ship captain who wrote Amazing Grace? The man who had steered Wilberforce back into politics in 1785? Newton lived to be an old man. He grew blind, he grew weak. But he lived long enough, and this is documented, to see William Wilberforce's Slave Trade Act pass in 1807. He was in his 80s, in his last months of life, when the news reached him. Newton had once been the captain of a ship carrying enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage. He had once been part of the very trade Wilberforce was now abolishing. And now, at the very end of his life, he saw it all coming to an end. He is often quoted as having said, on his deathbed or near it, quote, "My memory is nearly gone, but I remember two things, that I am a great sinner and that Christ is a great Savior." That statement is well documented, recorded by his friend Richard Sassel in his biography of Newton. It is real. Newton died in December of 1807, less than a year after the Slave Trade Act became law. He wrote Amazing Grace. Yes, he really did. John Newton wrote the words to Amazing Grace, likely around 1772, for a New Year's Day service in the small English village of Olney. The tune Americans sing today is actually American. It was probably an old Appalachian folk melody, and the words and the tune were paired together in the United States in the 1830s. So the song Americans think of as their own Amazing Grace is, in a very real sense, a transatlantic hymn, the English of a repentant slave trader, sung to an American tune that became the anthem of freedom for millions. And that is how tightly interwoven this story is with our own. The abolitionist movement that Wilberforce led in Britain was one of the direct inspirations for the American abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass, when he traveled to Britain in the 1840s, was received as a hero and pointed directly to the example of Wilberforce and his allies. American Christian abolitionists, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Congregationalists in New England, evangelicals in the Western states, drew strength from what British Christians had done. The two struggles were not identical. American slavery was much more deeply woven into the economy of the Southern states, and it took a civil war and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans to end it. But the moral argument, the argument that human beings cannot be property, the argument that Wilberforce had thundered from the floor of the Commons for 20 years, that argument crossed the Atlantic. It helped shape the conscience of a young Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, who would go on to sign the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. 30 years after Wilberforce died, Wilberforce's legacy did not stop at slavery. He was one of the founders of what became the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the very first national animal welfare organization in the world. He worked to reform British prisons. He supported education for poor children. He worked to spread Christian missions abroad. Though modern people have very mixed feelings about the missionary movement, both positive and negative. He was involved in dozens of charitable causes. His friend and biographer, Sir James Stephen, wrote that Wilberforce belonged to what came to be called the Clapham sect, a group of wealthy, evangelical, reforming Christians who lived near each other in the London suburb of Clapham and pooled their energies to change the moral shape of Britain. In American terms, imagine a small group of neighbors in a suburb of Washington, D.C., quietly, for 40 years, changing the moral direction of the entire United States. That is essentially what the Clapham sect did. Wilberforce's descendants continued his work. His son Samuel became a bishop of the Church of England. Another son, Robert, became a well-known theologian. Through his 6 children, William Wilberforce has many living descendants today. They can be traced through the Wilberforce family lines and remain, in some cases, prominent in British life. His great-great-great-great-grandson, Gerald Wilberforce, was a well-known British conservationist. Other descendants have worked in law, in the church, and in public service. So yes, if you are wondering, William Wilberforce still has living descendants in the world today, and some of them continue to speak publicly about their famous ancestor. There is a lovely book, if you ever want to read more, by the American writer Eric Metaxas, called simply Amazing Grace, William Wilberforce, and the Heroic Campaign to End Slavery. It is one of the most widely read modern biographies of Wilberforce among American readers, though scholars often point to William Hague's biography, William Wilberforce, or to the older scholarly works by Robin Furneaux and John Pollock as more historically detailed accounts. The film Amazing Grace, released in 2006 on the 200th anniversary of the Slave Trade Act, starring Ioan Gruffudd as Wilberforce, is also a very accessible introduction, though like all historical films, it simplifies and streamlines the real story. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you were listening to this story 200 years ago in the United States in 1825, you might have been listening in a candlelit farmhouse in Ohio, or a merchant's parlor in Boston, or a slaveholder's dining room in Virginia, and the reaction to Wilberforce would have depended entirely on who you were. In the free states, he was already a hero, a moral example, an inspiration. In the slave-holding states, his name was cursed in some quarters, feared in others, and grudgingly respected in a few. Southern planters saw the British Empire's example, and many of them said, "That will never happen here." Others, quieter Southerners with troubled consciences, saw it and thought, "Someday, it will have to happen here too." And it did. Which brings us back to the question of why any of this matters today. Why should a 21st century American in Kansas or California or Georgia or New York care about a short, sickly Englishman who died almost 200 years ago? Because the story of William Wilberforce is, in the end, a story about what one person can do. Not with wealth, though he had some. Not with power, though he had a little. Not with strength, because he had almost none. But with conviction, with persistence, with a refusal to give up. He tried to abolish the slave trade in 1789. He failed. He tried in 1791. He failed. He tried year after year, again and again, and he lost. Again and again. And then one day he won. And then he kept fighting until, 3 days before his death, he heard that slavery itself was going to end. The American writer Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote, quote, "A hero is no braver than an ordinary man, but he is brave 5 minutes longer." Wilberforce was brave 5 minutes longer, for 46 years. Whenever anyone asks whether one person can really change anything, whether their vote matters, whether their small voice matters, whether their small local effort matters, the answer that history hands back is the small, sick, half-blind man from Hull, who could barely stand, who nonetheless brought down an empire's participation in the greatest evil of his age. Ben Franklin, one of our own American founders, wrote at the very end of his life, in 1790, as president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, that slavery was, in his words, an atrocious debasement of human nature. That was the same year Wilberforce was starting his first big push in Parliament. Two men on either side of the Atlantic, both saying the same thing at the same moment, both in their own ways, planting seeds that would take decades to bear fruit. Or take Frederick Douglass, who said in a speech in 1852, quote, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe." Douglass understood, as Wilberforce had understood, that slavery was not just cruel to the enslaved. It corroded the moral life of the entire society that permitted it. Or take Abraham Lincoln, who famously said, quote, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." That is a real Lincoln quote, from a letter he wrote in 1864. It could have come out of Wilberforce's mouth. And this is one of the great gifts of history. It shows us that people in very different places, in very different centuries, keep arriving at the same moral truths. It shows us that the human conscience, when it is allowed to grow, keeps growing in a certain direction. Toward mercy, toward dignity, toward the recognition that every human being, no matter what color, no matter what country, no matter what condition, matters. Wilberforce would say that this was not an accident. He would say that the same God who made all people is the God who slowly awakens the conscience of nations. Others might frame it differently, but you do not have to share his faith to be moved by what he did with it. Now, I want to be honest with you about something else. There are people who have criticized Wilberforce over the years. Some critics on the political left have pointed out that he supported various laws restricting workers' rights and free speech during a time when Britain was terrified of French-style revolution. Some have pointed out that he did not do more for the poor of England, that he focused on faraway suffering, while some suffering in his own backyard went unaddressed. There is truth to these criticisms, and honest history has to acknowledge them. Wilberforce was not a modern progressive. He was an 18th and 19th century conservative reformer, working within the political system of his day. He was not perfect. Nobody is. But he committed his life at enormous personal cost to ending one of the greatest evils in the history of the human species. And by that measure, and by every fair standard of biography, he was a great man. Was he humble? Yes, by all accounts, remarkably so. He hated praise. He deflected credit constantly. He gave money away in secret. He preferred small conversations to large speeches, even though he was one of the great speakers of his era. Boswell, the great biographer of Samuel Johnson, once heard Wilberforce speak and wrote afterward, quote, "I saw what seemed a mere shrimp mount upon the table, but as I listened, he grew and grew until the shrimp became a whale." That is a real recorded observation, a real quote about Wilberforce from a real witness. His personality, according to those who knew him, was warm, quick with a joke, deeply affectionate, sometimes scattered, always kind. He was a great singer. He loved music. Composers of the day, when they visited London, sometimes asked to hear him sing. He kept an enormous circle of friends. He wrote thousands of letters. He was, in modern terms, a networker of astonishing energy, though a networker in the service of ending human bondage rather than in the service of himself. Did he want to become a priest? Yes, briefly. In the early days of his conversion, he considered leaving Parliament entirely and taking holy orders. John Newton talked him out of it, and every enslaved person who was later freed by a British Navy ship on the high seas of the Atlantic, freed because of a law that Wilberforce fought for 2 decades to pass, owes something to that quiet conversation between a young MP and an old ex-slave ship captain in 1785. Now, if you take away nothing else from this story, take away this. Not every great historical change comes from a march, a revolution, or a war. Some of them come from a stubborn little man with a Bible on his desk and a bad stomach, standing up year after year in a room full of people who don't want to hear him. Some of them come from ordinary citizens who decided to boycott that West Indian sugar because they believed it was made with blood. In one of the largest consumer boycotts in modern history, an estimated 300,000 British households refused to buy slave-grown sugar in the 1790s, forcing sugar prices to drop and putting economic pressure on the whole slave-holding system. That is what movements look like. That is how history is bent. Wilberforce could not have done it alone. He was the tip of the arrow, but behind him were Thomas Clarkson, traveling on horseback, interviewing sailors, Grenville Sharp, fighting the great early legal battles against slavery in the London courts, Hannah More writing anti-slavery poems that ordinary people read aloud in their parlors, Olaudah Equiano writing his own autobiography as a formerly enslaved African, a book that shocked British readers into recognizing the humanity of the enslaved. The Clapham sect, the Quakers, the tens of thousands of ordinary people who signed petitions, more petitions on abolition than on any other subject in British history to that date. And after Wilberforce died, others took the fight further. Thomas Fowell Buxton kept it going in Parliament. Zachary Macaulay and his son Thomas Babington Macaulay, the great historian, kept pushing. In the United States, the abolitionist cause would be carried by William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Sojourner Truth, John Brown, and countless others, ordinary and famous, until at last, in this country, slavery was ended too, at terrible cost, in 1865, with the 13th Amendment. That amendment says, simply, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." 32 years after William Wilberforce died, knowing his fight had been won in Britain, the same fight was won in America. The chain of history runs from Pennsylvania Quakers in the 1760s through William Wilberforce, in Parliament from the 1780s through the 1830s, through John Brown and Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln in the middle of the 19th century, and forward to the civil rights movement in the 20th century, when Martin Luther King, Jr., stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial and said, quote, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The same truth, the same argument, the same moral conviction, century after century. Wilberforce believed that history was moving somewhere, not because human beings were naturally getting better on their own. He would have been the first to say that we are not. But because there is, he believed, a moral truth built into the universe that keeps pushing at the human conscience like water pushing at a dam. And in his lifetime, in one small corner of the ocean of history, that water broke through. And here is the part that ought to give every American listener chills. William Wilberforce lived long enough to know. Do you understand what that means? He lived long enough to know that slavery had been abolished in the British Empire. 3 days. 3 days between the vote and his death. He was on his deathbed, in a house in London, when the news arrived. He was told. He knew. He turned to the friend by his bedside and gave thanks. And then he closed his eyes. That is not a movie. That is not a Hollywood ending. That is history. That happened. If you are ever tempted to think that persistence does not matter, that a slow, quiet, decades-long effort cannot amount to anything, remember that a man in an iron brace, half blind, with a body that could barely stand, lived just long enough to hear the news that the empire he loved had done the thing he had asked it to do for 46 years. And then, having heard it, he died in peace. Here are 10 things about William Wilberforce that most Americans have never been told, and they are all true. 1. He was so short that a rival politician joked about his stature, but so eloquent that the same rival privately said he was the finest speaker in the House. 2. He personally paid the debts of struggling friends, including his own eldest son, whose business ventures nearly ruined the family fortune. 3. He wrote a spiritual bestseller in 1797, a book on Christianity that was so popular it went through 15 editions in his lifetime and was translated into multiple languages. 4. He was one of the founders of the world's first National Animal Welfare Society. 5. His personal daily prayer diary, which survives in archives, shows that he prayed by name for enslaved Africans he had never met. 6. He proposed to his wife Barbara after knowing her for barely more than a week, and their marriage was, by every surviving account, remarkably happy. 7. He suffered from a chronic bowel disease that many modern historians believe was ulcerative colitis. Decades before that condition even had a proper medical name. 8. He walked with a stoop so severe in his later years that a specially made steel corset had to be worn under his clothes just to hold his body upright. 9. When he was buried in Westminster Abbey, both Houses of Parliament literally paused their proceedings so that members could attend his funeral, an honor almost unheard of for a man who had never been Prime Minister. 10. On the day the House of Commons passed the Slavery Abolition Act, a friend rushed to his bedside to tell him the news. Wilberforce, dying, is reported to have wept and said, thank God he had lived to see it. And through all of it, threading through every one of those 46 years like a red thread, was his faith. Whatever your own beliefs may be as you listen to this, whether you are a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, a Hindu, an agnostic, or someone who does not think much about religion at all, the historical record is unambiguous on this point. William Wilberforce did what he did because he believed it was what his God required him to do. He believed that every human being, of every color, of every nation, of every station in life, was made in the image of the Creator, and that treating another human being as property was a direct offense against that Creator. He did not think of abolition as optional. He thought of it as commanded. You can debate the theology if you wish, but you cannot honestly separate William Wilberforce from that conviction. It is the engine of his entire life. Without it, there is no 46-year campaign. Without it, there is no Slave Trade Act of 1807. Without it, there is no Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, at least not on that timeline. Historians can argue about counterfactuals until the sun goes down, but the actual historical record shows a man moved to relentless, career-endangering, health-destroying action by a religious belief in the equal, God-given dignity of all people. He wrote once, in his diary, a line that I want to leave with you. He wrote, quote, "If to be feelingly alive to the sufferings of my fellow creatures is to be a fanatic, I am one of the most incurable fanatics ever permitted to be at large." Feelingly alive to the sufferings of my fellow creatures. Think about that phrase. That is what he wanted to be, feelingly alive to the sufferings of others. Not comfortable, not distant, not looking away, feelingly alive. And when he was old, when he was sick, when he was retired, when his fortune was gone, when he had lost his best friend, when his body was failing, he was still feelingly alive to the sufferings of his fellow creatures. On the far side of the world, on plantations in Jamaica and Barbados, in the holds of ships that would soon be intercepted by the British Navy, in villages in Africa, where children would grow up in freedom because of what he had done. Human beings, whose names he would never know, were about to have their lives changed because a little sick man in London refused to shut up. That is the story of William Wilberforce. And if you take one thing from it, take this. You do not have to be tall to be great. You do not have to be strong to be great. You do not have to be famous, or rich, or powerful, or well-connected, or well-dressed, or well-liked to change the world. You have to be willing to see clearly what is wrong. You have to be willing to say it. You have to be willing to say it again, and again, and again, when nobody wants to listen, when everybody is against you, when your own body is telling you to lie down and stop. You have to be, in his words, feelingly alive to the sufferings of your fellow creatures. And you have to, in the words of an American proverb, Wilberforce would surely have loved, keep hammering, because water wears down stone, not by force, but by persistence. He hammered for 46 years, and the stone gave way. That is the extraordinary life of William Wilberforce, a boy from Hull, small and sickly, who became one of the greatest moral voices in the English-speaking world. A young man who nearly lost himself to fashionable London society. a converted Christian who nearly walked away from politics until an old ex-slave ship captain named John Newton told him to stay. A young member of Parliament who watched his best friend become the youngest Prime Minister in British history. A husband who fell in love in a week and stayed in love for the rest of his life. A father of 6 who crawled around on his floor playing horse with his children. A politician who lost the same vote for 2 decades and refused to stop. A dying old man who lived just long enough to hear that his life's work had been finished. And in a small, quiet grave in Westminster Abbey, beneath the marble of England's greatest cathedral to the memory of its heroes, he rests still next to William Pitt, near kings, near saints, near poets, near soldiers. And every year, tourists from around the world, including thousands of Americans, walk past his monument, sometimes without realizing whose memorial they are looking at, and read those simple words, that he lived to see the extinction of that odious traffic in the persons of his fellow men, which he had spent so many years opposing. He lived to see it, barely, but he lived to see it. And because of him, and because of the movement he helped to lead, so did millions of others on both sides of the Atlantic. From the free ports of England, to the freed villages of Africa, to the Emancipation Proclamation of the United States, to the civil rights marches on Washington in our own American memory. A long, long chain, all linked, all part of one of the greatest moral stories the human species has ever lived. And it began, or at least, it took its greatest single leap forward with the stubborn courage of a small, sick, half-blind man from Hull who believed all the way down to his bones that no human being should ever be owned by another. His name was William Wilberforce. Now you know his story. Pass it on.